Great. Well, thank you very much indeed. It's a real honour to be asked to do this, and a real pleasure. I am only sorry that I'm not able to come to Kaunas, as everyone is saying, but 20th Century Society actually did, we run regular foreign trips for our members and our supporters, and before COVID we were lucky enough to come to Vilnius, and we were told you absolutely can't go visit the country without going to Kaunas, and I totally concur that it is full of heritage, absolutely full of heritage, as Vidas mentioned earlier. It was a great pleasure to be there. And I also really wanted to just start by saying that I'm sorry not to be meeting up again. All the work I've done in England has been incredibly informed and sustained by my international connections with people through DocoMomo, through ICOMOS, through the Preserving the Recent Past conferences that were organised by the Park Service in the States, and through the Getty Keeping It Modern programme, which I've been very pleased to be involved with. So I know that many colleagues that I've met through all those organisations are involved in Innova, and I'm sorry not to be meeting you again in person at this instance, but hopefully soon. So I wanted to say that in a way, the conference description poses a double question. It asks whether post-war heritage can and should remain for future generations as a relevant part of our history. And I'm really delighted that we've got papers that will look at both the can and the should of these questions. They're both really crucial issues. And no one is asking either the can or the should of Georgian country houses, for instance, despite the fact that a lot of those have ongoing complex repair issues, and also, most recently, particularly here in the UK, have entered the debate about contested heritage. They've become very problematic buildings as their histories, as the product of the profits from the slave trade, are revealed by recent research. So maybe our buildings aren't quite as uniquely difficult as we might fear. However, I wanted to kind of be upfront at the beginning of this and say that I absolutely think that the concrete heritage of the post-war period can be conserved, and it definitely should, and that the loss of these buildings would be absolutely irreparable. We would lose a major slice of our history, and a crucial one. And far too many buildings of this period, and really excellent examples, have all too often been demolished. We at 20th Century Society put together a campaign which we called Lost Modern, which looked back specifically at Britain's lost heritage, and just emphasised the fact that many buildings, which I think would future generations would greatly admire and appreciate, have already gone. And this here is the demolition of John Maidin's Birmingham Central Library, which we campaigned long and hard to try and get listed and to try and preserve, and was actually demolished really just to make a public open space. It wasn't actually demolished to put a new building up on the site. And I felt that was an incredible mistake, basically. So, and then some of the other buildings here in London which have gone are this school, Pimlico School in London, very innovative again, and built on the a site of buildings that had been demolished in the Second World War. Very much innovative in terms of its programme for education, as well as its use of concrete. And most recently, Robin Hood Gardens by Alison and Peter Smithson. This was a pair of curved linear blocks of public housing in East London, and one we again tried very hard without success to get this these buildings listed. We emphasise not only their architectural qualities and their innovative technological aspects, but we also made a lot of effort to examine how they were serving as housing today, and to work with housing specialists to show that they could actually provide good quality housing for the Bangladeshi community who have largely moved in the beginning of the 21st century, that the building could easily adapt to provide exactly the sort of public housing that was still an incredible need for in that part of the city. Sadly, to no avail. I really wanted to also to acknowledge that, you know, all sorts of people are doing fantastic work around the world. We've been very impressed by the SOS Brutalism campaign, which I think has been an excellent example of a project that is very largely founded on a social media base and has managed to have great impact. And I show this image from the SOS Brutalism site just to acknowledge that it's not just Britain. There have been major losses of fantastic concrete buildings all around the world. This one gunning near to you is one I particularly regret. Seems very sad that could not be found a viable new use and continue to exhilarate future generations. And I just wanted to put this piece in for two reasons. Partly because this is from Design magazine, so from a very kind of cool design-led magazine aimed at a very broad audience. And Design are celebrating the fact that the Louis Kahn dormitories in Ahmedabad are being saved from demolition after global protests. And C20 Society was part of that. We'd just been to India and had visited this building, again, as one of our foreign trips. And we were astounded that there were proposals to demolish these really absolutely first-rate structures. But I feel it is really positive that international concern and lobbying does appear to be starting to gain traction. Okay. And looking back a little, I also wanted to acknowledge the support we've had from the World Monument Fund. Back in 2012, we had three major buildings, the Birmingham Library that I showed you the picture of being demolished, a bus station in Preston, and the South Bank in London, where we had campaigned to get these buildings listed and preserved. And we'd actually convinced Historic England, who are the British government's official advisors, to support us and to make positive recommendations that these buildings should be listed. But in England, we have a politician, a national politician, gets the final vote in all three cases. The recommendations of experts were overturned by politicians, and these buildings were turned down for listing. So we wanted to bring external pressure at an international level on the British government, and putting British brutalism forward with these three specific examples exemplifying it was a way for us to do that, and I think it was incredibly helpful, and I'm very grateful to WMF for their part in helping us perhaps turn the tide in the UK. So just breaking down that two-part question that I've kind of lifted from the intro to the conference description, I think we can think about it in two ways. What are the physical conservation challenges, and can they be technically overcome? And obviously we've just already had a glimpse of the amazing work that Innova is doing, and I'm really excited to know more. particularly about new consolidants and the corrosion inhibitor work and the hydrophobic coating work that's been going on. All of those seem to me to be things that can have an enormous impact hopefully implemented in a fairly short time span. But the other part of the can, of course, is will there be the will and the commitment from both building owners and heritage bodies to ensure that best practice is implemented? And I know that that ensuring that those that the products of the Innova research project are actually disseminated and got out and taken up by the market is a crucial part of the project's objectives, and obviously that's great to know and crucial to the success. So, and then if we think about the should, why should we be interested in conserving these buildings? I think we really need to focus on what future generations would miss out on if the post-war heritage was lost. And we need to be thinking more about who it will be that gets to decide what's happened. In the introduction, it talks about how these are a relevant part of the history and a relevant part of our history. I think we need to really analyse what we mean by both relevant and by our history, and think about both how we think of that in terms of today and how future stakeholders might answer those questions as well. So a few reflections on where we are now, which I think is really, really difficult to read. I think there are many, many positive things that are happening about how people are reacting to concrete buildings at the moment, but also still some enormous barriers to be overcome. In the UK, we worked with a very small, cool startup graphic design business, Blue Crow, on their Brutalist London map, which has been incredibly successful and encouraged people, I think, to visit buildings and to just hold them in much higher esteem. There are things like this: build your own Brutalist Great Britain, have it at your fingertips. This is just a very general product, decorative product. If you feel your walls are bare, you can now buy online this brutalism-inspired wall piece, and this is very much kind of I think brutalism breaking into the mainstream and being seen as acceptable and at home in a very domestic setting. It's no longer a threatening image, and I mean this is brutalism reduced to a pattern. It's brutalism is perhaps no longer scary in this context. And then my last example of these is we've just been approached at 20th Century Society by another startup company, Brute Wax, who want to make these rather extraordinary brutalist building inspired candles. They've had a successful Kickstarter campaign to get their startup money, and they are going to donate a percentage of their profits to us, which is very generous of them. But I think it's really interesting that this is happening, and I think it's particularly interesting that they are marketing this product. All the shots show one or other of the more recent books about brutalism that are very much based on glamorous photographs in the shot. This is Simon Phipps's book, Brutal North, I think. Yes, alongside this candle, which I'm not entirely sure exactly. I don't think it is meant to represent any specific building element. It's meant to capture the essence of brutalism. I'm slightly sceptical about that, but I think it's great as a endorsement of the kind of growing level of enthusiasm for brutalist architecture in Britain, and that can only help to support our work to campaign to keep the actual buildings themselves. But it's certainly not all good news. This is just a snapshot from the news page of our 20th Century Society casework page, and you'll see here that we have three examples all in a row of very significant post-war concrete buildings in Britain where there are current proposals to demolish or majorly mar with incredibly insensitive alterations some of the best buildings of the post-war period. So we certainly haven't won the battle yet. And Gunny asked me to perhaps just give you a bit of context about 20th Century Society and where we've been. I don't want to dwell on this, but let me very quickly say that we were formed as the 30th Society in 1979 and changed our name to 20th Century Society in 1992. And that really did mark a major shift from campaigning principally for the buildings of the interwar period to those of the post-war period. And so it's mainly that era of the society that I've been involved with. We gained an official role in the planning system in 2005, which puts us on the same ranking as all the other amenity societies, such as the Victorian Society and the Georgian Group and the Society for Protection of Ancient Buildings in the UK, which have been established, many of them going back to the Victorian period. And I have a real, I think, sense of embeddedness within British culture. So it's great that we've joined that group and are seen as having value by government. Yes, the first major case that I dealt with when I joined 20th Century Society, which was back in 2003. This was a building where the owner attempted to justify his demolition of a unique historic building by saying that its concrete construction specifically made it completely impossible to live in a 21st century world. And we obviously, I think we have moved on enormously since then, but some of the best known examples of concrete architecture in the UK remain without any protection. This is the South Bank Centre in London, including the Hayward Gallery. And this is still not listed, despite having been recommended for listing, I think now 6 times. It has, this is a slew of press releases about the site that we've released over the years. It's been issued with a certificate of immunity, which means it's a guarantee to the owners that it can't be given protection, and it's a very long-running saga. But on a more positive note with this one, it has actually, we did actually manage to ensure that the recent refurbishment was actually remarkably sympathetic, despite the fact that there was no historic preservation protection in place. In the past, we resorted to somewhat frivolous, perhaps, tactics of issuing a whole series of images like this, because we were faced with an application to put an enormous roof extension on that building. And we made the point that you just wouldn't attempt to in that way by photomontaging the form of the extension onto a number of images of iconic pre-20th century buildings in the UK. This is the Royal Albert Hall, a big concert hall, which is a major Victorian monument. And we made it look deliberately ludicrous to make that point. Now, however, we have managed to get quite a lot of key buildings, and I think we're beginning to get some of the sort of second rung down post-war buildings listed. So here we have the Dennis Lasden's Royal National Theatre on the right, which has been listed at grade 2 star for a long time. And at the end of last year, we were able to get the partner building on the left here, which is slightly later, and a commercial office building. It's the headquarter building for IBM, and we've managed to get that listed. And we did that to resist major proposals to again put on a huge roof extension, but also to remodel both this facade against the river and the facade that runs between the two buildings. So, that felt like good news. Dunelm House, on the other hand, we still don't know what the outcome of this case will be. Dunelm House is one of my absolute favourite buildings. It's by the Architects Co-Partnership, built in 1964 as the Student Union building for Durham University, and it sits on the riverbank immediately opposite the Norman Cathedral at Durham. So in an incredibly sensitive historic setting. It's a World Heritage Site, and it is just a stunningly beautiful building, lots of very direct Corbusian quotes. I think incredibly sensitive to its setting, as well as sculpturally really just magnificent. Anyway, we are, I think, on our third attempt to get this one listed, and have been campaigning really hard to try and persuade the university to find an alternative use for it, or if they can't use it, to put it up for sale. We think it would make quite a nice boutique hotel, and we are hoping for positive news on this one in the very near future. What makes this one particularly interesting is that the reason given for not listing it was that the developer, the consultant acting for the university, specifically argued that the quality of the concrete meant that the building was irreparable, and not only irreparable, but it was evidence that it had been sloppily built and badly constructed from the beginning, and therefore was of little merit. So we totally refute this. This is a shot just showing, I think, the quality of construction and the beauty of those concrete surfaces. There is some spoiling, but I think probably most of you will have many, many, many examples that look far more drastic and problematic than this, which I think is really just very superficial damage to a first-rate building. And yes, this was from the argument in favour of demolition, and it emphasised not only the material qualities of the concrete, but the fact that concrete construction, by its very nature, made the building less flexible and therefore had less of a viable future, and that again contributed to reasons for its demolition. This one would have so many awful precedents were it to be allowed, that we put a huge amount of effort into fighting to ensure it doesn't go through. And I am just wondering whether maybe concrete buildings' moment as the building type, the heritage that everyone likes to hate, may just be over, and maybe the heat is offers. Certainly in the UK, the most contested heritage now is certainly not the post-war concrete buildings. It is the statues and monuments with associations with slavery. The statue of Edward Colston that was dragged through the streets of Bristol and thrown in the harbour has now been fished out and is on display in the local museum, covered in spray paint. And although the vast majority of the statues that this debate is around are 19th century ones, it's certainly one that covers our period as well. This is Sir Thomas Picton, less well known, than Colston, but also, as well as being a hero of the Battle of Waterloo, he had a period where he was a plantation overseer and was convicted and then had his sentence commuted for the murder of a 14-year-old slave girl. So this statue, although it's one of a set of 12 from 1914 in Cardiff City Hall, we have said that we feel that its temporary, at least, removal is entirely justified because of the strength of feeling around what this stands for. Not least because these statues in City Hall, Cardiff, of which there are 12, are known as the Welsh heroes, which I think makes this even more contentious than it would otherwise be. I try and think about what we do at 20th Century Society in terms of this kind of combination of things. We do spend an awful lot of time reactively responding to individual threats to buildings, doing casework on individual buildings. But we do also spread out and do broader thematic campaigns. And we also use our visits and lectures both as a fundraiser to finance the casework, but actually as a way of advocacy and visibly demonstrating the public interest in these buildings by showing up. We have an extensive publications programme aimed at different audiences, and I'll expand on that a little bit in a moment. And we have been using social media more and more and more, and I'm sure that's just going to expand exponentially further in years to come. And I think really at the root of what we're doing is press lobbying. We totally feel that we need to demonstrate public interest in these issues to both local and national government, and the best way of doing that is through press coverage. And so we spend a lot of time considering how best to achieve that. So I showed you earlier some of the individual images from our Lost Modern campaign. This brought together initially 10 buildings that we felt were outstanding that had been already demolished. We're expanding that and we're asking people to send in further examples. Moving on to our publications, we have an annual, biannual journal that covers building types, usually, sometimes geographical. So on the left is our article about our journal about the Oxford and Cambridge colleges and university buildings, and our journal about the architecture of public service, town halls, and other public buildings, courthouses, police stations, fire stations, many of which are obviously fantastic concrete structures and many of which are at risk. Previously we've looked both at buildings for business and West of Britain, where some of these use of concrete was first demonstrated. Those journals are very much aimed at an academic audience, and they're peer-reviewed, and they are about sort of increasing the sum of knowledge in the field. We felt we wanted to complement them with various other forms of publishing, and we've done a series of monographs on individual architectural practices. John Maiden, who designed the library that in Birmingham that you saw being demolished, and the vast majority of John Maiden's work seems to be being demolished if it hasn't already gone. And Howell, Killick, Partridge and Amis, who are major brutalist architects who whose work I think is fabulous, and so far has survived rather better. But the absolutely crux of this is we work in partnership with a publisher who I would love us to be looking at well known and already well understood practices. As obviously we would sell a lot more books, but the idea of this is specifically to nurture the reputations of practices that we feel have been unfairly neglected and forgotten. So that's what that's about. And then we have done books. The Robin Hood Gardens book came specifically out of all the research work we did to try and get those buildings listed, and we self-published that. But we've now moved on to work with a mainstream publisher, Batsford, who are enabling us to do a series of essentially picture books, but with some quite meaty essays. And those are much more aimed at broadening our audience and trying to make 20th century and post-war architecture in particular accessible to a much wider audience, and really kind of embed it as part of the mainstream of British culture. And then finally, we do a magazine, and the magazine is designed to be a lot more fun and to have regular features. We have a regular feature where we go and interview someone who's successfully and happily living in a 20th century building. We speak to an artist whose work has been influenced by their reactions to 20th century architecture. And we also look back, and we have a regular classic book section and a selection of ephemera items each year, each issue, which is again about sort of encouraging people to really understand the richness of source material there is for interpreting the buildings that we're campaigning for. One thing that I was really pleased that we could include in the magazine recently was a feature on one of my favourite 20th century publications, which is Concrete Quarterly magazine, which I wanted to really make the fact that this is an extraordinary resource, and it's available online for free through the Concrete Society. It's just a fabulous record of buildings as they looked in their prime in the 60s and 70s particularly, and we managed to find the person who'd edited this magazine throughout its peak period and talk to him about how the buildings were depicted there and how they were selected, and how he felt the presentation in his magazine had affected their reputation over the years. We also obviously use our website, and we have every month we have a building of the month written by a huge range of different authors, and many of those have featured concrete buildings, and we have a rolling programme of buildings of the month lined up, but we always interrupt that and squeeze in a building if there is an immediate specific threat to it, as a way of publicising it. And this is just an example of one of the things that we've been doing on our Instagram account. This is a detail of the concrete bridge by Ove Arab, actually immediately next door to Dunelm House, the student union building I showed you. And we asked architects, photographers and artists all over the world, actually, in this instance, to pick their favourite detail from a 20th century building, and we posted those initially on our Instagram account, and we felt they were such a lovely collection that we've actually put those into a book format as well, and that seems to have been very popular, particularly under lockdown. I'm actually off next week to Westdean, which is a large country house in Sussex, where I teach the practical building conservation course, which is run with Historic England, and out of that course really came the book on the left, which is one of the practical building conservation guides, which are, I think, probably the sort of the most establishment guidance on conservation practice in the UK, and a lot of that information has come out of the work that we've been able to do by being based at West Dean with time and space to do some practical explorations. And we're at West Dean because it's a foundation set up by by Edward James, who when he died, wanted to set up an institution to further the study of arts and crafts. And West Dean were particularly keen that we should introduce the historic concrete module because Edward James actually spent the latter part of his life in Mexico at Las Posas, where he created this extraordinary concrete garden, and which of course has its own conservation issues. Okay. So, I mean, kind of looking back, I first wrote about architecture in this book, which was published in 2004. And at that point, I think my strategy there with that was that I would put together a whole load of case studies about really exciting and glamorous new concrete architecture and combine that with the history of the architecture, concrete architecture of the past. And through that means, rejig the reputation of concrete architecture in the UK and give it a much more positive spin. I think one of the interesting things that has happened since then is that new concrete buildings now are somewhat problematic. The enormous amount of energy required to produce new concrete, I think, has made choosing concrete for a new building now an increasingly a difficult choice for architects to make. But I think on the plus side, I mean, I think this really should mean that we value the concrete that we've already got even more, because the possibilities of building concrete buildings on the scale that we did in the 60s, 70s and 80s are probably never going to be repeated. I think there's a huge amount of work that has been done successfully and which INNOVA is part of. I particularly, I'm sure this will be someone from Getty, I'm sure will be drawing attention to this, but I think this is a really useful resource. And again, freely available to download. And what I like best about this document is that it does give you a very simple, well, it maybe doesn't look wildly simple on this slide, but at least it gives you all in one place a kind of rationale and a process to work through to complete a concrete conservation process. And I think that it's an incredibly useful tool to have to hand, and something that really does represent how we've moved on in our thinking about concrete conservation. So I guess for me, as I talk to people in all sorts of different respects about concrete, these are my basic objectives. I think, notice it's there is really important. There are an awful lot of buildings where concrete is critically important, but perhaps not as visible or as dominant as it is in some of the ones we've already been looking at. But concrete is often really, really important as part of a palette of materials. And for instance, painting concrete means that its relationship with adjacent brickwork is completely changed, and the overall appearance of a building can be severely marred. I think it's really important to understand how concrete buildings are made and to really think about this question of significance in a very broad sense, as I've suggested here. I don't think you can begin to meaningfully assess the condition of a building or consider conservation and maintenance until you really understand what you've got in the first place. So I think the remaining challenges are perhaps these, and this brings us back to the can and the should that I started with in that first question. So I think we really do still struggle to accept that concrete can have an attractive patina. I think that's something we really need to keep on addressing. I think we are lacking in craft skills that a lot of these buildings require. I've worked with quite a lot of sculpture conservators who have brought, taught me a huge amount, but it's transferring those skills as well as the potential of technological developments that Innova represents. It's pulling those together to make sure that we can really ensure the long-term life of these buildings. But I think we really have to look at that last point as well. We have to find acceptable ways to improve environmental performance of these buildings. Unless we can do that, I don't think we are going to win the battle in the long run. And increasingly, that is something that we are running up against. And I think it's looking at ways to improve insulation standards and alternative power sources that we really need to be looking at in combination with the restoration of the actual fabric of the building. And I think we also absolutely do need to accept that we may all think these buildings are fantastic. We may describe them as beautiful. We may have a real emotional response to them, but not everybody does, and not everybody will. We need to emphasize the rich stories they tell, not to be afraid to accept that they might be complex. I know that we're all in very different circumstances in terms of the history of the last 70 years, and that concrete is associated with a huge range of different things in different countries and contexts, be it political, be it building type, be it levels of expenditure, where these buildings, luxury products, for us, the National Theatre, very high-end university buildings, but also mass-produced social housing. And there's a dichotomy there in the UK, and I know there are much more challenging ones in many countries beyond the UK. So I think really we just have to strive to have an honesty and an authenticity in our approach, to really be very straightforward about what these buildings were, why they were built at the time, what they embody, and also that to really accept that it is the material fabric of the buildings as well as the design that together makes them so special and gives them the power to have this role that I think we'd all want to see them have. And just to finish up finally, I wanted to say that we've just put together our 2021 Buildings at Risk list. There are only 10 buildings on the list, and I just thought it was interesting to note that 4 of them, these 4 that I show you here, are substantially concrete buildings. And on the whole, there's no housing there. These are all buildings that were prestige buildings when they were completed and are now thought to be redundant and facing demolition. So there is still a huge amount to do and to achieve in winning the hearts and minds to develop the will to conserve post-war architecture, as well as the means, which I hope we're going to learn a huge amount more over the next 2 days. So thank you very much.